just watched part 2 of the video, so here we are with the reflection. Um, we're talking a lot about evaluations in this one, and kind of the gap between general population and fitness testing, as it were. So the first thing in the video, we talked kind of about, a refresher on like programmatic versus systematic, and kind of the characteristics of each, programmatic being more copy and paste, and systematic being a little bit more fluid and having a little bit more room for variance and kind of following different pathways. I think that pop culture in fitness sucks. I think there's so much bad information out there. And I know that sounds very cynical, but like there's more bad coaches than good coaches. And social media empowers everyone's opinion equally, which is an amazing thing in a lot of contexts. But in terms of the spread of scientific information, it can be very difficult. Research is verified and peer-reviewed for a reason. You can just get on Instagram and say anything. Now, what comes to mind when you think of evaluations? I mean, every sport I've ever coached has a myriad of evaluations. I mean, you can talk about for basketball, a vertical jump and, standing broad jump and all this stuff. And soccer, you have your sprinting and your agility tests. And, we listed all of them. There's a million different tests for a million different things. But for the most part, they do all quantitatively measure capacity. None of them are really quality assessments. Now, you said something interesting. A good coach will notice things. And I think something that goes hand in hand with that is athletes make things look easy. So if you watch an athlete running, for example, you can see the difference between an athlete who is like really struggling against their biomechanics versus someone who is very comfortable and elastic and fluid and athletic looking. The qualitative difference there can be very clear, but only if you're looking for it. I think strength and conditioning, especially at the high level, is predicated completely on quantity because people are expected to have already developed all of the qualities they're supposed to before reaching that level. Now, I think where this has gone wrong is that people look at the systems that they use in schools like Michigan and Ohio State and these really big colleges, and they try and take them down to these like D3 colleges and, hey, this is how we're going to operate at UMass Boston because this is what the best people do. And realistically, my coach at UMass Boston had us do a litany of less complicated tests because the reality is a lot of us are still struggling with biomechanical problems. We as D3 athletes were not the same caliber as those guys at Michigan, and we probably had a lot more dysfunctions. So we started with things that were a lot more qualitative baseline assessments, looking at how do you squat, looking at how do you lunge, versus just jumping into like big max testing and everything. So what about us when we think about qualitative diagnostics? So the obvious answer here is the FMS. So I'm going to not elaborate too much on that because that's like the obvious bridge in the gap. So in terms of sports, when I used to coach at Success Academy, when I was coaching track and field specifically, we did a lot of like specific athletic testing where, say, like I wanted to understand better how my long jumpers are moving, I would maybe take my long jumpers and we would go from a short approach, have them jump off of a box or off of a springboard so that they had more hang time in the air and they could practice their biomechanics. And I could really see what their motions were, and then we could kind of work on the granular stuff to make the things better. But again, these specific athletic tests kind of leave out general population. So I guess you could like follow your client to work and watch the conditions under which they work to better understand. But practically that's kind of impossible. When I was a kid, I used to compete in karate. I started very young and I competed all the way up until I left for college. And we used to do katas or forms where it's a series of prearranged movements, and we were all fighting and competing at a high level, and we would do these forms, and my sensei would look at us and say, all right, that kid's hand speed is not where it needs to be, or this kid's foot speed is not where it needs to be, or his plyometric speed is not where it should be, based on what he was seeing in these forms, these kind of like pre-programmed assigned actions that he was having us do. So again, quality, but also very specific and not applicable to general population. So then again, what is the general population equivalent? The FMS does bridge a big gap there. I think, again, just on, following the ladder, it doesn't make sense to, test for capacity if you can't, function through a range of motion properly. And I think the key here is just test and retest, test your quality, train for a block, test the quality, train for a block, test the quality, train for a block. And then after a while, if it's passable, then maybe we can start assessing capacity. But yeah, all right, that's video number 2. Part 3 coming up soon. Cool, man.